fully agree with you, but the fact that we guys got together from our part of the world, we don't want to claim too much and show that we are grandiose. I mean, we will work through, and if you're part of the world, I know Richard, we very firmly support our, you guys can support.
Informed consent in Sri Lanka, review of research conducted in Sri Lanka to understand the progress of informed consent process.
Thank you. Now we have been talking about ethics and research ethics for up to now. Now I'll be talking about research on research ethics. This is actually a part of a larger trial that we had conducted. I'll be presenting some of the data. Now the team that is involved was from the Forum for Research and Development, and this study was done in collaboration with King's College, University of London, and funded by the Wellcome Trust. Now talking about the background, Sri Lanka has an effective state-run healthcare system with free healthcare delivery, and which is particularly advantageous for the economically deprived people of the country. Because of this, Sri Lanka has a very good healthcare standard, resulting in healthcare indices comparable to even most developed countries, better than most countries in the region especially. Even though the culture of scientific research is still in the developing stages in our country, when it comes to medical research, it's quite productive. Our medical faculties and government healthcare institutions produce quite a lot of medical research. With this enormous power difference between researcher, who may be the medical caregiver in the free healthcare system, and the research participant, who may be economically disadvantaged patient, the potential for abuse may be considerable when it comes to medical research. Now, since I'm talking about informed consent, this informed consent is considered the cornerstone of ethical conduct and regulation of human subject research. That means mostly medical research. Consent, you may all be quite aware of what informed consent is, but just to underline what it means, when consent is considered to be informed, when it's given by a person who understands the purpose and the nature, but participating in the study requires a person to do and to risk, and what benefits are intended from the results from the study. So he gives either consents or does not consent, considering all these factors. In our study, the objective of this component of our study was to carry out a comprehensive review of documented evidence of informed consent practices and procedures as featured in published medical research literature in Sri Lanka. This is how we got on to doing it. One of the things we did was to do a Medline search to look for all the research medical journal. We also did a survey of the Ceylon Medical Journal's research articles published between 1999 and 2005. Ceylon Medical Journal is the biggest medical journal, most significant medical journal in our country, and it is the only Sri Lankan medical journal that is indexed in Index Medicus. And thirdly, we studied all the MD and MSc theses available in the Postgraduate Institute of Medicine Library, produced by postgraduate students for their examination, for their MD and MSc exams, medicine, family medicine, community dentistry, and there were some other fields as well. Now we provided with this. That is, for ethical clearance, have they annexed a copy of the ethical approval, a letter from the leaflet or the consent form. Now I'll go on to the results. Out of 87, 4% mentioned about obtaining ethical clearance. Now, in this time frame, we looked in the CMJ what sort of trend there was from 1999 to up to 2005. You can see it has risen from 17% to 71%. So, this is regarding those in those articles whether they have mentioned obtaining ethical clearance or not. So, as you can see, the percentage has been gradually on these same 72 CMJ articles. Only 44% had mentioned about obtaining consent. Earlier I was talking about obtaining ethical clearance. This is regarding obtaining consent. And 25% of those who had mentioned about obtaining consent specifically mentioned that they have taken informed consent. And others had just mentioned that they had taken consent only. When you look at the trend in obtaining consent, it also shows that there is a gradual increase from 1999 up to 2005, from 42% up to 71%. Now, thirdly, the MD and MSc theses. There were 104, that is 34%, had mentioned about obtaining ethical clearance. However, only 6.5% had provided evidence, that is, they have not attached any evidence that is ethical clearance letters from institutional review boards. And considering the trend in those, that also clearly shows a trend of increasing in the amount in how many theses had mentioned about obtaining ethical clearance, and also the amount of people who have mentioned about provided evidence for obtaining ethical clearance. In the same 305 MD thesis, 191, that is 62% had mentioned about obtaining consent, and either obtaining consent or that it's not relevant to that study. They have mentioned either that they have obtained consent or obtained consent because it's not relevant. And 26 of those, that is 8.5, had provided evidence for it. This, in that as well, you can see there's a gradual increase in the percentage, those who have mentioned obtaining consent in their MD theses with the years. Now, in conclusion, we can say that there is an improving trend in documenting of obtaining ethical clearance and informed consent in medical research projects in Sri Lanka, and it's very encouraging to see. Possible reasons for this could be increasing awareness about ethical requirements by the researcher, journals and examiners requiring information on this to be included for them to be published or to pass the exam. There may be other reasons as well. But the ethical conduct of research is improving. There's no way that we could absolutely say that, because this does not allow making any conclusions in the quality of information provided to the participants and the consent provided. These are just documentations that they have done in their papers. Now, we recommend similar to reporting on.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hewege, and especially for really sticking to time, and so we can have the full complement of questions. Yes, maybe I'll allow the lady first. And then...
Do you have a separate, when you go for IRB approval, when you fill up the forms for IRB approval, do you have a separate form for social science research?
No.
Related to medicine? Because it's a very big problem in UK, and it just doesn't provide any special forms, and the science forms are very technical, and most of the time, they ask questions like, what is your primary endpoint of your research? Well, in social science research, there is no primary endpoint. So those kind of questions, that was one thing I wanted to ask. And is there a standardized informed consent form? That for all sorts of research you use the same form?
It's like this. Now, to answer your first question, most of the ethical review committees in Sri Lanka are based in the universities and the medical faculties, especially the medical faculties. So because of that, most of them in their forms that they produce for us to apply are mostly in relation to medical research. Actually, from what I know, they do not have a separate form for any other type of research. If it's not relevant, if some of the details are not relevant, you just have to tick it off and say that this is what we are doing. So that's one thing. And the other thing you asked was, sorry, I didn't remember. No, actually we don't, there is no form that has been resolved. They get their own in relation to the research that they do. Yes.
I have a follow-up question, but I think I should at the
Maybe.
I'd like to make a comment and then ask a question. You noted in your, but I would guess that there is no evidence in any of the studies to show that people understood. They signed the document, but that in no way indicates understanding. I feel that in fact the term informed consent is a bad term because it is a passive process. You have forms and you indicated that there were forms that were filled out, but at no point does it indicate whether people truly understood what they were getting involved in. And therefore I think that as good as your study is, it's flawed because it never really addresses the issue of understood consent, which is really the ultimate purpose of the process itself. It would be like asking us if we all understood and if we raised our hand, that would indicate understanding. Well, the first thing is when you don't understand, you always shake your head. Yes, I understood something else.
Okay, first of all, let's say that what I presented here was just a small part of a larger study on informed consent in Sri Lanka. Most of the other things were qualitative research that we did to study what understanding of consent was for researchers, the public, and research participants. So those things I did not discuss here. That would be much more interesting, I'm sure, but we haven't completed the paper yet, so I couldn't comment on that. So you are absolutely correct, but from the part that we did, there is no way that I could say about their understanding what they are going to give it to the participant. There is no idea that we could, I mean, there's absolutely not. It's just a proxy measure of informed consent.
A question that relates to your paper and also to the Chinese paper. When we were collecting the samples for the haplotype mapping project in Japan, and we had to also follow a community engagement model where we agreed upon a certain number of meetings they had to attend, actually participants expressed that both having to attend these meetings and having to read the documents and sign a paper were burdens that they didn't feel like they wanted to have. So it's actually similar to the paper here. So I wonder, in your study of informed consent in Sri Lanka, did you also find anything relating to that feeling of this?
That's a very good, important question because up to now, as the previous speaker said, that when we went to sign, I mean, we think that complete information leaflet is a good thing, that they could get all the information and they could give an answer, and signing is a good thing. But when it comes to some of the different cultures, it's very different. In the work I said, qualitative part of the research that we did ask about what sort of information they wanted and how long would they like to take and that sort of detail. So we did address that issue, but I couldn't actually offhand say what the results were. But basically what I could say is that a long information leaflet is a deterrent. They do not wish to either they don't read any of it at all because it's too long, or just they don't give consent because of that. So what we believe is there should be a stepwise manner where the basics should be allowed for those who are interested, and if anybody needs to know further, there should be a separate form to go further, and that's what I mean. The things in the developed countries, any consent seems to be quite different from the developed world.
I just want to compliment what Suwin said and to answer that question. In fact, one of our large studies we did in Colombia, but we ended up having 3 information leaflets, as Suwin said. And we have done an extensive amount of informed consent process work embedded within other research projects. In fact, we have, as Suwin said in this project, we asked about public understanding of informed consent process, information, how much they would. And in fact, we went to the ethics committees with the WHO checklist. But before that, open-ended question asking them what should be the essential components in information leaflet and consent form, and comparing and contrasting with the WHO thing. So all this is yet to come, Richard, and I think it's a very big process, and I fully agree with Amir, and we had a very interesting thing, and people don't want to sign. Somebody actually signed, then that person's land was sold illegally by another person. That person came straight to us alleging that we were behind it, he has not signed any document. There are very interesting case studies we have put together, and we in fact got our 40 research assistants to develop case studies based on real case scenarios and coming out with qualitative information. And one last comment for my colleague, rather than translating and back translating, it should be adaptation. So this is my selling point. I mean, I would want people to use that method because that generates much more scientifically rigorous way of doing things rather than translating and back translating.
Can I just respond for a sec? Actually, we ended up doing a little bit of a different thing. We had the Bengali version and we made sure that it was reliable and valid. We didn't translate it word for word because of the issues that you mentioned. The other issue is that this signing consent forms is not only in Asia. I worked with a group, did a focus group with African American CNAs, certified nursing assistants, in the south side of Chicago, and they did not want to sign the consent forms for the focus group. They said that they really didn't want to do that. So I modified and they agreed to just say on tape that they agreed and they were in the conversation. But having the signature on a piece of paper, I think all over the world can sometimes be a problem.
If I may say, signing, I think everywhere in the world, it implies a kind of secretary, it could have some. Okay, please, maybe we can have the last one and then from Dr. Sivakami and then we...
IRBs, if a project is being reviewed by two IRBs, one Western IRB, another one a local IRB, they want the informed consent, for instance, to be translated and back translated. If you translate, for instance, double-line, randomized control, placebo-controlled trial into our language, Urdu, it becomes an extremely horrible thing. And it is just absolutely, you cannot do that. The concept is not translatable. The objective should be to translate the concept rather than the words. So back translation and back translation just does not work. I agree with you.
You both are really sticking to standards, very rigorous standards. That is my question to Dr. Devjani Mukherjee. And my question to Dr. Ali, when you are conducting researches with the host country and the guest country's approval and the vaccine trials, in case these vaccines are to be prepared by the host country and the IAVI, who is supposed to be the donor, IAVI, International Initiative for Vaccine Development, HIV I am talking about, and in that case, if you are preparing vaccine, you give the contract to some companies where they will benefit only IAVI and the countries which are financially supporting IAVI, and it doesn't support the countries where the vaccines are developed, so that it will benefit their own people and the neighboring people where the subtype C virus is prevalent. This is my question. It's not there.
Okay, I see Devjani who might give the answer, but I don't see Ali here. So maybe his answer can come later.
I think it depends on the institutional review board, and it's hard to make a blanket statement. I've applied to various ones in different institutions, and sometimes, depending also on who is reviewing the project, sometimes they've actually given helpful feedback that improves, for example, looking at the way that you get informed consent. And then sometimes they've raised red herrings that were not that helpful and took many weeks. So I think it really depends, and it's hard to say. Personally, I think having a lot of colleagues who serve on these review boards, that they're a necessary screening, but maybe the way that they look at certain projects could be improved. As Meena mentioned, for example, qualitative social science research, international research, and encouraging people from different backgrounds to be on the IRB might help that. So I don't know, maybe I'm a little more optimistic.
So I think I would like to thank all the presenters and discussants for a very lively session. And I don't know whether
So we resume at 15.
I'm from India, and the introduction has been given by the Honorable Professor Sang-yong from Korea. My regards to Chairman and to my fellow speakers, those will deliver this audience after my speech. And in fact, it is a very long title, but I'd like to see that I can complete within the term of 10 minutes allotted to me. I'm not repeating the title, it is already there. So how to analyze a question that I'm from agricultural sciences background, especially in terms of agriculture, then the genetically modified crops and the food items, they are coming into the picture. And there are many stakeholders to play different roles. They are having different kind of perceptions. And the public in general, from the farmers to the educated people, to the media, they are having certain role to play. They are having certain limitations, liabilities and assets to understand the things, the pros and cons both. So in analyzing that, let us have a look into the kind of backdrop that we need to have a systematic review if we are going to get into the realm of this particular subject. That is insight in research literature, why do we stand now, fill gap for the research, and it is method, results and conclusions obviously. And the research questions naturally when you are trying to address some of the issues. So how can you characterize the literature and public perception of biotechnology or genomics as such as a whole? And do trends exist in the literature on public perception of biotechnology or genomics? What do scientific indicators tell us about the scientific nature of the published articles on public perception of biotechnology or genomics? If you look into the trend, the research focus, mostly if you look into the three different phases, 1970 to 2000, 2001 to 3, and the ethics research you are seeing that is dropping down, and that may be the reasons that we need to look into, focused into the realm of this particular discipline and to realize what is happening and to get inside. And you see the publication here also, that is 1990 when the Human Genome Project initiated, and then GM Soya to European Union and Genomics, and focus from ethics to perceived benefits and risks. Now let us have a look into very specifically, I am going to highlight a kind of case from ISA of Gorton group, that in 2006, if you look into very specifically, the first year of the second decade of commercialization of biotech crops from 2006 to 15, the global area of biotech crops continued to climb for the 10th consecutive year at a sustained double-digit growth rate of 13%, or 12 million hectares, 30 million acres, reaching 102 million hectares to 50 million acres. It is notable that the year-to-year increase of 12 million hectares in 2006 is the second highest in the last 5 years in absolute area, despite the fact that the adoption rates in the US, the principal grower of biotech crops, are already over 80% for soybean and cotton. It is also noteworthy that in 2000 India, the largest cotton growing country in the world, registered the highest proportional increase with an impressive gain that almost tripled its BT cotton area to 3.8 million hectares. This is overall the global area of biotech crops. Total industrial and developing country, it is increasing. And then the biotech crop countries and mega countries, 2006, you see the India, 3.8 million hectares exclusively on cotton. If you look into a previous assessment, a long back, that was 1999-2000, from Wisconsin, there's a why the perception, so the people's perception is very much needed to be understood and to be analyzed. The distribution and response of questions regarding BT cotton varieties
to conventional varieties, and in 1999, if you look into the yield, expenses, space damage, and profit, if you look into the 4 dimension, and if you compare this particular figure, keep in your mind, and the next one, you will see changes in 2000. So it is the very authentic or very logical background that you need to have a kind of understanding about the public perceptions and attitudes. And you will get a response from year to year difference and the kind of understanding, the impact on the basis of the impact of the media, the impact of the government uses, impact of the corporate sectors, their interactions, their participatory approaches, within their logical and legal limit. The safety first approach, 3 legs of biotechnology governance, because we were talking about the public perception of biotechnology. We are performing one duty to make the people aware, especially in developing nations, where the biotechnology communications are just shooting up. So naturally, public government and producers, mostly the corporates and the public institutions to some extent, in collaborations or in isolations. Now let us look into what is individual perceptions. And individual perceptions of the risk and benefits of a new technology is determined by personally selected sources of information, values, interests, and individual experiences. However, where agriculture, biotechnology is concerned, most people cannot rely on their own experience. Instead, they depend on information received from other sources such as rumors, the experiences of people working in the field, and statements issued by industry, government, public interest groups, academia, and the media. This study reflects specifically, I'm just closing down to the center of this particular study that we could make out so far, reflects the reliability of the statement of the government sector still exists better in India, especially. 35% of the public said that they would agree with the government statement, 21% says not agreed, and 44% were not sure about it. The credibility of the corporate sectors have also been identified, and there were less trust on such statements, with 17% believing, 36% not believing, and 46% neither agreed nor disagreed. Response categorization reflecting that, in general, if you look into that, there was an earlier study, the genetically engineered foods or biotechnology in the Indian food supply received a mean rating of 2.84 on a 4-point scale, from not at all concerned to very concerned. 100 respondents, if you look into, then US 3.61, so it's much lower. Regarding open categories questions, people fail categorically to express their views in India, which shows their limitations still there of present understanding about biotechnology and its related issues, especially to agriculture. If you look into the awareness domain of the perception related to different options given to the respondents, results reflect that 5 developments the most of the people have heard of, and mostly these kind of studies are being followed with the kind of huge studies made in Japan by world leading group Professor Maslow. And in the pesticides, 56%, in vitro fertilization 41%, genetic engineering 32%, and fiber optics 28%. To be aware of genetic is a different thing from accepting genetic manipulations. We need to look into that. The proportion of the rest of the responses I am not going into because time is going out. So far as the understanding in different technologies are concerned in India, the public percent pesticides, and you just look into where the cloning and bioethics are the remotest areas of understandable issues, 11% till there. And there is a comparison between the Japanese and Indian situations. And if we look into a comparative perceptive mode related to different technologies with respect to biotechnology in India and Japan, then following relationship could be found out. And it is India, it's still lower. You see biotech, computers, and pesticides in all these domains in comparison to Japan. And in this paper, we could come out with an analysis which identifies 6 key factors influencing people's opinions about the subject, which account for about 63%. And these factors are individually giving, not just repeating these numerical figures. The results of cluster analysis of consumers' response to various questions about biotechnology suggest that respondents can also be classified into 5 groups, that is benefit seekers, self-protectors, biotechnology opponents, open-minded biotechnology learners, and biotechnology optimists. These are the proportion of response in each cluster. And if you look into the dimension of public that I have just mentioned, the 4 factors, the factor 1 to factor 6, and all are significant if you look into that data. The value of the mean standardized factor, and asterisk denotes the statistic is significant and 0.05 level. In spite of the detailed and comparative analysis of the public perception issues of biotechnology, there exists a rich public debate about how the potential risk associated with biotechnology methods and bioindustry products should be addressed, assessed, and about whether and how bioethics should influence public policy. A general structure of guideline public policy discourse is generally emerging. Expert opinion supports a range of positions. Now 2 questions are coming. 2 human social benefits such as living a longer and leading more productive life due to biotechnology outweigh the harm that an animal or groups of animals must experience to produce those benefits. Second is, should an insurance company require information, but nicely elaborated in a story's drama, information about an individual's genetic inheritance as a condition of eligibility for health insurance? Biotechnology's risks are sometimes purely conjectural. We need to look into that again. And there are inherent conflicts involved in how biotechnology develops as an industry and the way ethical questions and public policy positions are discussed and adopted. Then how to define and evaluate man's fundamental long-term relationship, how to address the pressure to rapidly advance scientific research, what priority to grant commercial needs to quickly realize a high return on a very expensive investment in it. Between these are the problems are coming, potential health, economic and business benefits are huge. Biotechnology, bioethical issues are not simple. It is difficult to know which biotechnology-induced changes in an organisms or productions technology might result in large-scale social or economic changes. If you look into that, those who are hardcore biotechnologists, Cry1AC in the BT transfer, naturally, who knows that Cry1AC being combined with the soil beneficial microflora, and a series there is a kind of gene flow within the microflora, it can change in a long term with a huge impact into the soil system, and there with the productivity, the production technology as such will be hampered or may not be. It needs a thorough look into. Measurements of the socio-economic and market effects of new technology are hard to make, because in the WTO regime we are looking into. There is pressure to achieve immediate short-term economic gains that might have essentially unwieldy long-term effects. Issues are set within conflicting time horizons and value systems. The deadline, the definition of what safe means and how to evaluate an acceptable level of risk is still evolving. And maybe for that matter we are here every to assess the risk in a particular tangible term, very precisely. There is strong competitive pressure to go forward with new and potentially risky technology in a global market. And from this study, a substantial positive correlation came out between science journalists' attitudes toward democratic process in science and trust in newspapers. There exist moderate correlations between attitudes and trust in televisions, positive, and biotechnology industry representatives, as it came out as a negative one. In other words, as science journalists, attitudes keep their trust in newspapers and television. Perception of information source trustworthiness, bias, and fairness. Here, some kind of a mathematical interpretation, some of the based on some data. Journalists responded to 3 multi-part questions designed to collect their perceptions of 9 information sources: trustworthiness, bias, and fairness in communicating agricultural biotechnology issues. Results are sorted by descending total grand means. Overall, journalists perceived university scientists and researchers as trustworthy. They felt essentially the same about newspapers as being trustworthy. Likewise, they agreed as a group that activist groups were untrustworthy. Although a sizable fraction of the public feels that public opinion in general as either a product of citizen deliberation or as uninformed feelings is less important than scientists' opinion. Now, as because we are in Thailand, now genetically modified food of Thailand, have a look into some of the beautiful genetically modified papaya, very tasty. We are eating for the last few days, and we will be eating too. This transgenic papaya of the Department of Agriculture, one of the field from Thailand. And transgenic virus by non-transgenic papaya, I can make a distinction, because this photographs doesn't mean that I'm at work for your attention. Room crop.
you. Any questions? Professor Ellen Kittson from Charles Sturt University, Australia. She'll be talking on community consultation for statement of ethical principles for biotechnology.
Good, very late afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much. I'd first of all like to thank the organizers for giving me an opportunity to discuss some important work that I was involved with a year ago. This work is still continuing, and it's with the collaboration of my colleague Michael Gorton, whose name appears on the abstract, and is the chair of the Victorian Biotechnology Ethics Advisory Committee that I'm here today. I also would like to reference the presentation of the Honourable Minister of Science and Technology for the Government of Thailand, when on Monday he emphasized the importance of good governance in emerging technologies will be a requirement for more discussion on ethics, where both lay people and scientists alike were involved. And he particularly referenced voluntary codes, and I'll be discussing one of those today, as a way in which risk management could be addressed for public perception. So that was a very useful introduction to my talk. Now, rather than provide many slides, I will take an opportunity just to address these following questions. First of all, what I'd like to discuss with you is who actually was the Victorian Biotechnology Ethics Advisory Committee. I'm here representing a document that they prepared about ethical principles. Well, who are they? They're actually a group which was established by the state government of Victoria in Australia. At the time I was working in the Department of Health for that state government. The government was seeking a source of independent advice, and so the Ethics Advisory Committee had a very interesting composition. It was membership involving both those impacted by and involved in biotechnology. So some of the membership were people who were particularly involved in research for biotechnology or had a law background. We also had an ethicist, which was both laymen and laywomen drawn from the community. There was also people who had advocacy skills for consumers, animal welfare, or environment was in our state and invited expressions of interest. When the committee was established, their first task was to put out a paper which was actually about the communication of biotechnology concern in health areas versus in agricultural applications or in biomedical research. They also were looking for, well, one reason the committee advised this to government was that they felt that to put out any sort of code of practice would be difficult, as biotechnology had a place in the fields of health, agriculture, and environment, and so principles was probably a better way to approach where those areas intersected. But they also were concerned that there should be an educative tool available to the community, and particularly with the ethical principles, starting the community and empowering the community itself to debate issues in a better way, and activities of those involved in research and commercialization of biotechnology, but also to help the public have a better understanding of the issues involved. So how exactly was the community engaged? Well, this is outlined in the abstract in your booklet, but one interesting point I would make is rather than starting out with sort of a draft statement, in fact what happened is our first step was to go out to the community themselves and say, what do you think? It needed further exploration, so there was a series of meetings in the community with both scientists and wider and broader community groups to discuss whether, if there was such a code and you tell us what you want in it, how do you actually think it should operate? And so, of course, we were guided in our thinking to make sure that the code would be voluntary. We thought that that would give it its greatest flexibility. A draft code was prepared and circulated. Once again, there was advertisement in the media calling for comment and submissions. We received probably between 100 and 150 different submissions, not only from within the state of Victoria, but all over Australia. One interesting feature of the community consultation was a student forum. So 30 high schools in the state of Victoria actually got together and they debated whether the draft code of ethical principles would make any difference to practice. And that was a very useful exercise. Their concerns were quite different than the established viewpoint of the adult community, be they researchers or lay people. They were very focused on future impact, and that once again helped guide our thinking when we finalized the statement. It was finally signed off by the Government of Victoria in January 2006. Now the features of the code themselves, and I should point out on the back table, I've actually left documents for people to collect, but once again, based on the initial feedback that we had from the community, they were looking for some contextual setting for such a statement of ethical principles. And so not only did we come up with a statement which had these agreed ethical principles contained within it, but we also included in, if you like, in a kit, and this brochure you see here on the screen is the front of the kit. We also included a statement which would allow people to give consideration to how best to carry out ethical practice. We wanted people to understand the context or the environment that our particular statement sat within. Now, I can go on. Another question we wanted to look at was how would people who were in these different industries actually be able to apply the ethical principles within their own industry, and also based on the different types of principles, how would they be able to understand the context for a principle applying to their own activities. Was finalized, there's probably very much a representation of equal weighting that we gave to the input from whether the balance is right. I think that one of the statement actually fit into the regulatory environment because it is voluntary. In Australia, we actually have a national regulator of gene technology who does license different applications for gene technology, and that's a national. There has put out a document which is trying to encourage a national framework for ethical issues in gene technology. So our statement in the state of Victoria will actually be complementary to that and fit into that. The other thing I would point out is this organization, the BBRT, the Victorian Biotechnology Ethics Advisory Committee, is actually not founded in law, so it's very much policy focused. Also, in terms of ethical issues in Australia, we would have human research ethics committees, and we also have an Australian health ethics committee which looks at ethical issues in health. Now, the last thing I wanted to comment on, although I'm here today as a student at Charles Sturt University, I still am a bureaucrat, but still at this point in time, rather than the Victorian state government, I'm in the Australian government, and of course I'm not here representing their views. But as a policy maker, I think it's very important, I hear all these good ideas and these wonderful thought-provoking initiatives discussed at meetings like this, but they're only as good as them translating into practice. And my view is some advice on how to influence policymakers. I think that, and I learned this in working so closely with an independent advisory group, First of all, you have to make sure that what you're trying to influence actually has relevance. And I mean that from the relevance from the viewpoint of the government. So be aware of what their policy concerns are or what may be driving their viewpoints. I don't think you can be overly ambitious. If you take a particular position, I think you will be more successful in influencing policymakers if you can demonstrate that that position has a broad base of support. You have to be prepared to be responsive and understand that there's both immediate payoffs for your influence, but maybe also think about what in the longer term you want to be able to accomplish with your influence. Act very transparently, and the important thing is to seek alliances and buy-in from groups that perhaps you're not normally in a relationship with. And so I think that this is part of demonstrating broad base, but also it's very useful in terms of informing your actual position, because there may be things you hadn't thought of when you want to take a position forward. I think it's important to self-promote your positions, but if you're going to promote your positions, make sure whatever message you give has a consistency, because that also builds a credibility with policymakers. The last thing I just would like to say is the Victorian Biotechnology Ethics Advisory Committee, 1 year out, the chair, Michael Gorton, tells me that he actually is now this year going to go back and see how well the Statement of Ethical Principles has been adopted by the biotechnology industry. That's a task that they have for this year. And also continue to address other government concerns, such as my colleague mentioned, genetically modified foods and crops and their future place in Australia. So I'd like to thank Michael in his absence and the members of the Ethics Advisory Committee for the very challenging and exciting initiative we put together, members of the Victorian community, and of course yourselves and the organizers of this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions?
The principles that you have listed, in the community, in their perception about these ethical principles that you have listed here, is there any prioritization, or at least are you aware of any kind of prioritization being done by the community?
Thank you. That's a really important point. If you look at the actual document itself, there'll be a disclaimer about whether anyone or the other has because it is very inclusive, it will be difficult to say from the perspective of someone who may apply these principles which one would have a priority. But the very interesting, one interesting outcome of the student forum was they wanted to set priority on these actual ethical principles. And for them, once again, this is maybe 150 students, about 17 years old, from private and public schools and religious-based schools as well. They actually felt that the natural environment and benefit and harm were very important. They particularly were thinking about benefit and harm in intergenerational or future terms, but natural environment also featured quite highly. However, that was the students, and for the users, we hope that they're all important, but they may apply them with their own set of priorities.
Yeah, it would vary a lot, naturally, among different interest groups, yeah.
Yes, please.
What are the Statement of Ethical Principles, which they felt they would inherit the impact from its use. So, but I think that they themselves were perceiving what the world would look like when they themselves grew into a maturity and adulthood. And they had some very strong views about what they wanted that world to look like.
School of Law. The title is Biotechnology, Genomics, and Global Health, a challenge for traditional bioethics. Please.
And I, of course, have an entire survey of the biotechnology and ethics world to get through. I think that basically I'm going to shorten my presentation substantially. What essentially my thesis is that as we take a look at biotechnology, genomics, and global health all together, what we will see is that traditional Western bioethics as we know it today is going to be changing and indeed is already stressed, as we've seen it by many of the other speakers of the conference today, by the incredible dynamism of the science as well as the changing world that we live in. So today I'm going to briefly run through some of the ethical issues that come up as we move through the research pathway from research to the marketplace, and then spend a few moments talking about some of the specific biotechnology and genomic products that are already giving us the stresses that will necessitate the expansion of what might be considered traditional Western bioethics to become more encompassing of some of the other theories of ethics that we've heard about at our conference. We all know about the traditional Western bioethics and the principles-based approach, so I won't spend a great deal of time on this. And I think we've already heard during the conference so far that we are already beginning to see that it is creaking a little bit as we look at populations, at global health, and one could argue subjects beyond humankind, like ecologies. As we take a look at the challenges of biotechnology and genetic research, we know that as we use human DNA to make new tests, new products, new therapies, researchers are venturing into areas that are intuitively more intimate and personal. And we see that in terms of the pedigrees, the idea of risk to privacy is extending beyond individual subjects to their greater, more extended families. How do we get consent from all of the parties in the pedigree, and are we must we do so? We see a different classification of risks than we used to see with traditional medical clinical research, where we very often focused on physical risks, and now we must focus on psychological, psychosocial harms and risks. As we move down the pathway of progress in building a new genetic product, we see there's additional problems brought to us by conflict of interest. This is a very entrepreneurial area around the world. And as a result, there's a greater concern that researchers may be influenced by their interest in remuneration down the road or ownership in a very lucrative product more than they might be interested in the actual improved health outcomes that might be derived from their product. This in the United States has manifested largely as a result of several technology transfer laws, which are on the screen, and has led to the idea that indeed our universities are kept by commercial concerns. As we have tried to grapple with this conflict of interest situation, as we heard earlier from Professor Bailey, we've had some very difficult institutional and societal conversations in the United States in terms of the public-private cooperative model of research and what conflicts it builds. How can we manage such conflicts? Is zero tolerance feasible? We've generally had policies of zero tolerance in our government officials and in many of the universities, including mine. It's incredibly difficult to police. Is disclosure of a conflict enough to guarantee that a subject will not be imperiled or a patient will not be imperiled by a researcher or a provider's desire for public interest in the downstream impact on global health? Researchers, both public and private, seek to patent their discoveries as early as possible and preserve their competitive edge and their ultimate investment, intellectual investment. This, of course, may foreclose access to the very scientific information that other scientists may use to take us to the next threshold in scientific discovery and indeed the next new discoveries that will benefit humankind. We see the problem of licensing fees, increasing the overall costs of downstream products making them unaffordable to the very people who need them the most. And in many cases, those very people are the ones in developing countries that are most imperiled by the modern pandemics. And ultimately, we see from a pure science standpoint, we can make the argument that patents could arguably retard the chance for new discoveries and better science rather than facilitate it. And it's somewhat ironic, of course, that our universities, because of those acts I just mentioned a couple of moments ago, are indeed full partners in the problem of patenting, as they frequently hold the patents. As we look at this patenting issue a little more deeply, we see that, particularly with respect to the United States, we have a patenting regime that is particularly protective of entrepreneurs and inventors, to the detriment of the idea of public health and public morality. We have no public order or morality exception for patents. We have no experimental use exception in the United States, and it's increasingly circumscribed in other industrialized countries. And of course, we see this most clearly profiled as we look at the issue of compulsory licensing. We've seen a number of countries, including recently Thailand, oppose the restrictive patenting regimes by compulsorily licensing antiretroviral and cardiovascular drugs, with good reason, in the sense that public health is imperiled, and to maintain and honor those patents and license would essentially imperil the very people who should be benefiting from the drugs. So as we look down the road to biotechnology in the future, we can really take a look at the idea that biotechnology is really in a very early phase. We've had the period where technology of recombinant DNA has led us to breakthrough drugs. We've sequenced the genome. Now we're looking at trying to figure out what that actually means in terms of disease and pathology and human health. As we begin to develop tests and hopefully drugs and therapies, we begin to move forward down the line in terms of the maturation of this amazing field. Down the line, where will we go? One could make the argument that the next stage might be the opportunity to use somatic therapy to improve human capacity. This may go well beyond the idea of the better baby or the designer baby, to issues like improving human beings so that they could withstand the perils of and flourish in the environment of another planet, which we may well need if we continue to destroy the one we're on. We also have the possibility, as we move forward beyond that, that in the next stage, the final stage, we might actually alter the human species. And of course, that is a prevailing fear. Taking us back home just to the products of today, we see lots of ethical issues coming up, and just the things that we have in our armament or being that should be accorded ethical consideration and should be brought in to our analysis of ethics as it applies to the science of tomorrow. In terms of predictive testing, this has been covered at great length about whether or not predictive testing is ethical, if indeed there is no utility to the testing where we can produce a better health outcome, but merely destructive information that may harm the individual or indeed create, in the case of a population, a genetic underclass. And of course, with genetic designer drugs, which drugs will get developed? Will they be the drugs that will benefit those who have the economic wherewithal to purchase them? Will we spend a great deal of money? Is indeed causing significant suffering to humankind in a much more significant bioethics, which is clearly alone inadequate to fully address any of the issues that I've talked about. Even within Western societies, forget, and especially as we move on and look beyond classical Western society. In the future, we're going to need something that is much more communitarian, much more global and will address cultural diversity, much more social justice oriented and will consider the skewing of justice by politics and economics. We'll probably have to transcend humankind and the rights of individuals there, and I think that is the end.
Thank you. Discussion is over.
I want to give my admiration to your presentations, and because you seem to endorse or taking into consideration the family into this new kind of paradigm of bioethics. But I wonder what you mean by the family dynamics you're taking care of, because maybe in the West we have a kind of broken family, and how do you put it into terms of legal statements or this sort of thing? Actually, you could give me some good ideas.
So your question is, when I speak of family dynamics, am I speaking of the traditional Western family or a broader concept of family? I'm speaking of a broader concept of family because I think that family is indeed much broader than perhaps the nuclear family that we envision in the United States, or even the extended family that we envision as we move looking at sort of the genetic family, which is much broader. We also have the issue of when we take a look at a family, one could also consider ethnic and popular as us, as opposed to perhaps animals, plants, and ecologies. So I think that all of, when I say family dynamics, I'm thinking of family in the broadest possible constructs.
But then how do you take into consideration these very kinds of families into the sake of obtaining of information or sharing of benefits,
yes,
or sharing of information?
Yeah, we've actually faced some of that in terms of some of the genetic research we've done at the institution that I work in. One of the issues we've run into is the issue of pedigrees that I think was on one of the earlier slides. And increasingly the movement is towards looking at getting consent from all of the parties in the family who might be implicated in the publication of a pedigree, for instance. This presents tremendous logistical problems because in many cases you may not have access to all those family members even if you could find them. And indeed, one of the